The early morning sun cast long shadows over the quiet suburban street. Rows of tables lined the driveway, each cluttered with an assortment of household items, trinkets, and forgotten knickknacks. A handwritten cardboard sign propped against a tree read, "Yard sale, everything must go." Among the sparse crowd of browsers was Clara Morgan, a local art teacher in her mid-30s. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a chance to stretch her legs, sip her morning coffee, and perhaps stumble upon something interesting for her classroom wall. Clara had always loved art with a story, and the occasional yard sale provided the thrill of discovering an overlooked gem. As she moved from table to table, her eye caught a small painting propped on a chair against the garage wall. The piece wasn't remarkable at first glance, a faded landscape of rolling hills under a pale blue sky. But something about it, maybe the brushstrokes or the way the light played on the canvas, drew her closer. "That one?" The woman hosting the sale looked up from her folding chair. "It was my grandmother's. Been sitting in our attic for years." Clara examined the painting more closely. The frame was simple but sturdy, its edges worn with age. The canvas itself was slightly yellowed, and the back showed signs of amateur repairs. Still, there was a charm to it that Clara couldn't quite explain. "How much?" she asked. The woman shrugged. $5? Clara handed over the money and tucked the painting under her arm. It felt surprisingly heavy, but she didn't think much of it at the time. With a smile and a quick "thank you," she continued down the driveway, not knowing that her small purchase would soon unravel a mystery she never anticipated. Back at her small apartment, Clara placed the painting on the kitchen table. Her walls were already adorned with an eclectic mix of artwork, some pieces from her students, others collected from flea markets and thrift shops. This new addition would fit right in. She poured herself another cup of coffee and sat down to inspect her find. Under the brighter indoor light, she noticed details she hadn't seen before. Subtle variations in the brushwork, a faint signature in the corner partially obscured by grime, and the faint outline of something beneath the surface paint. Clara leaned closer, her curiosity piqued. The landscape had always been painted over, but beneath the gentle hills, she could make out the suggestion of shapes. Perhaps a figure, or another scene entirely. Her fingers itched to clean the painting, to carefully strip away the top layer and reveal what lay hidden beneath. She decided to start with a gentle cleaning. Taking a soft cloth and some mild soap, Clara worked carefully at the edges, lifting years of accumulated dust and grime. As the canvas brightened, the faint shapes beneath became more pronounced. A flash of crimson here, a hint of gold there. Her heart quickened. Was there another painting beneath this one? Clara thought of her students, how they'd be fascinated by this process. She reached for her phone and snapped a few photos, already imagining a lesson plan around discovering hidden layers in art. Yet even as she tried to focus on teaching ideas, she couldn't shake the feeling that what she was uncovering was more than just an old painting. It felt like she was peeling back time itself. Clara spent the next hour painstakingly cleaning a small corner of the canvas. The landscape's green hills gave way to what appeared to be a golden archway, its intricate details shimmering faintly through the thin overlay of paint. The original artwork had been carefully concealed, but by whom and why? As she worked, Clara's mind filled with questions. Who was the artist? What was so important about the original painting that someone went to such lengths to cover it up? She remembered the seller mentioning it had belonged to her grandmother. Could the family have known about the hidden image, or had it been forgotten over the years? With each gentle stroke of the cloth, Clara felt a growing connection to the unknown artist. She pictured them painstakingly creating the golden archway, each detail carefully rendered. The colors beneath were vivid, as though untouched by time. It wasn't just a hidden painting. It was a preserved moment of artistic expression, waiting to be rediscovered. Her fingers brushed against something hard beneath the canvas. Frowning, she turned the frame over. Along the inner edge of the wooden stretcher bar, she felt a small, raised bump. Clara took a closer look and saw what appeared to be a tiny compartment, its edges expertly concealed. Her heart raced as she reached for a knife, carefully prying the compartment open. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Clara unfolded it gently, her hands trembling. The words written on it were faded but legible, a mixture of Latin and French. At the bottom, a signature caught her eye. It wasn't the same name as the faint signature on the front of the painting. This name she recognized from her days as an art history student, Jean-Louis Reynaud, a little-known but highly skilled artist who had vanished mysteriously in the late 1800s. Clara sat back, staring at the parchment. Her small yard sale purchase had just become a doorway into a mystery far larger than she'd ever imagined. Clara's mind raced as she studied the parchment. She had always been drawn to stories of forgotten artists and lost masterpieces, but this discovery felt different, personal. With trembling hands, she placed the note on her desk and took a step back to absorb the gravity of what she'd found. She decided to start by researching Jean-Louis Reynaud's life. Though she remembered his name from art history classes, the details were hazy. She flipped open her laptop, the screen's glow reflecting off the painting's gilded frame. As she began to dig through online archives and old academic journals, a clearer picture emerged. Reynaud had been an innovative artist in the late 19th century, celebrated for his experimental techniques and luminous color palettes. But just as his career was gaining momentum, he vanished without explanation. The few works he left behind were considered treasures, each valued not only for its beauty, but also for its historical significance. Clara's excitement grew as she cross-referenced the signature on the painting with known examples of Reynaud's handwriting. The looping letters, the way he slanted his R, it all matched. If this painting truly was a hidden Reynaud, it could be a monumental discovery. But why had someone obscured his work? The answer, Clara suspected, might lie within the painting itself. Clara recalled the faded inscription on the parchment, a cryptic reference to a place called Carter's Hollow. A quick search brought up only a few results, an old logging town that had been abandoned more than a century ago. Nestled deep in the forest and surrounded by superstition, Carter's Hollow had become the stuff of local legends. One particularly chilling account mentioned a group of settlers who vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some claimed the area was cursed, others spoke of strange lights and eerie sounds that drove people away. Clara wasn't sure how this tied into Reynaud's work, but the coincidence was too strong to ignore. With every article and old photograph she found, Clara felt the weight of the story grow heavier. The golden archway, emerging from beneath the canvas, suddenly seemed more than decorative. It felt symbolic. She wondered if Reynaud had visited Carter's Hollow, if the painting depicted a place that no longer existed, or if it hinted at a tragedy he'd witnessed. As she pieced together the fragments of history, Clara became obsessed. She stayed up late into the night, surrounded by printouts, books, and her laptop. The more she learned about Reynaud's mysterious disappearance and the eerie reputation of Carter's Hollow, the more determined she became to uncover the painting's secrets. Her obsession wasn't without its costs. Friends noticed her growing distant, and her students remarked on her distracted demeanor. Yet Clara couldn't stop. She felt a kinship with Reynaud, as if she were the only person who could give his story the closure it deserved. One evening, as Clara worked under the glow of a desk lamp, a knock at the door startled her. She hesitated before answering, her heartbeat quickening. Standing on the porch was a man in his 60s, dressed in a worn trench coat. His lined face and piercing eyes carried a weight that made Clara uneasy. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly, but there was something disheveled about his demeanor, like he had come in a hurry. "Are you Clara Morgan?" he asked, his voice measured but firm. She nodded, gripping the doorframe. "Who's asking?" "My name is Henry Glover," he said, producing a faded ID card that identified him as a retired curator from the local art museum. "I hear you've come into possession of a certain painting." Clara stiffened. The cautious tone in his voice put her on edge. "What do you know about it?" "I know it's dangerous," Henry replied, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That painting has a history, and if you've started uncovering it, you're already in too deep." "Dangerous?" Clara scoffed. "It's just a piece of art." "It's more than that," Henry said, glancing over his shoulder as though checking for eavesdroppers. "Raynaud wasn't just an artist. He was trying to capture something most people aren't meant to see. That golden archway in the painting, it's not just a symbol, it's a threshold." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. "Threshold to what?" "To something that doesn't belong in our world," Henry said grimly. "Raynaud disappeared for a reason. If you keep digging, you might find out why, but you might not like the answer." Clara crossed her arms, trying to appear composed, though her heart pounded. "And why should I trust you? How do I know you're not just trying to scare me off?" Henry leaned in slightly, his expression serious. "You don't have to trust me, but I know that painting. I know what happened to the last person who tried to uncover its secrets. They thought they could handle it too. They thought it was just another lost masterpiece, but it was never meant to be found." She hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. "What happened to them?" Henry didn't answer immediately. He seemed to wrestle with whether to share more, finally shaking his head. "It's better if you don't know. Just stop what you're doing. Put the painting away, lock it up and walk away. There are some doors you're better off leaving closed." Clara clenched her jaw, torn between curiosity and caution. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Do more than think about it," Henry said, his tone pleading now. "Do it." Without waiting for her response, he turned and walked back into the night, his trench coat flapping in the breeze. Clara watched him go, the painting still looming large in her apartment, and felt the weight of her decision growing heavier. Clara shut the door, Henry's words echoing in her mind. She turned toward the painting, its golden archway gleaming faintly in the dim light of her apartment. The idea that this piece of art could be more than it seemed, something dangerous even, was absurd, yet Henry's conviction, his urgency, and the undeniable connection to Raynaud's disappearance planted seeds of doubt. Was she foolish to keep peeling back the layers? Could the warnings hold any truth? Clara approached the painting, her fingers brushing the edge of the canvas. Logic told her to dismiss Henry's words. After all, it was just an old artwork, no different than countless other pieces she'd handled. But a deeper, nagging instinct urged her to consider the possibility that Henry was right. What if Raynaud had hidden something in this painting, something he'd meant to stay hidden? What if uncovering it was a mistake? Her gaze dropped to the small compartment she'd uncovered earlier. The parchment, now stored carefully in a drawer, had led her to Carter's Hollow, a place steeped in mystery. The more she uncovered, the more it seemed like the painting was a map, guiding her towards something buried in history, something Raynaud had left behind as a warning, or perhaps a challenge. Clara exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She thought of her students, the friends who'd been worried about her distraction lately. She thought of her career and her own passion for art, for uncovering the hidden layers of creativity and history. This was her calling, wasn't it? She couldn't simply lock the painting away. It was an opportunity not just for fame or recognition, but to tell the story of an artist who had vanished into obscurity. Dangerous, Clara muttered to herself, sitting down at the kitchen table. The word tasted strange, like it didn't belong in the same sentence as painting, but the strange sensations she felt when working on the canvas, the flickers of movement and light, the way the golden arch seemed almost alive, those sensations couldn't be ignored. She couldn't explain them, but she couldn't pretend they weren't real either. In her heart, Clara knew she wouldn't stop. The thrill of discovery was too strong, and the pull of the unknown was something she couldn't resist. No matter how unsettling the warnings, she was already too deep into the mystery to turn back. Reynaud's work, his vision, and his disappearance were a puzzle she felt destined to solve. She picked up her cleaning supplies, her hands trembling slightly, and began to remove more of the surface paint. As she worked, the golden archway became clearer, revealing faint outlines of figures beyond it, indistinct shapes that seemed to shimmer and shift. Clara's breath caught. This was no ordinary artwork. It was something far more complex and profound. For better or worse, Clara had made her choice. She would keep going. Whatever lay hidden within the painting, she had to know. Clara's hands moved carefully, her nerves taut as she worked on the next section of the painting. The golden archway, once faint and fragmented, was now nearly complete. Beneath the overpainted landscape, a vivid scene began to emerge, a place filled with swirling clouds and shimmering light. What had once been a simple landscape was now something ethereal, almost otherworldly. The figures she had glimpsed earlier grew more defined. They appeared human, yet their forms were distorted, their limbs elongated as though caught in mid-motion. The closer Clara looked, the more the scene drew her in. The golden arch seemed less like a decorative element and more like a passage to another world. She could almost feel the pull of it, as if the painting was inviting her to step inside. Her mind raced with questions. Why had Reynaud created this? And why had it been hidden for so long? Clara reached for her phone, snapping more photos. She planned to compare them to other known works by Reynaud, searching for clues in his style or symbolism. Perhaps there were other paintings, other gateways he had painted but never revealed. As she set the phone down, a strange sensation washed over her. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with an unexplainable energy. A faint hum, almost imperceptible at first, grew louder the closer she leaned toward the painting. Her fingers hovered above the canvas, the tips tingling as if static electricity danced just below the surface. Clara drew back, her heart pounding. "It's just in my head," she whispered, though the words did little to calm her. She glanced at the notes she had been keeping, dates, sketches, snippets of Reynaud's history. But none of it explained the strange feelings that now filled the room. She decided to take a break, setting her tools aside. As she stood and stretched, her eyes kept returning to the painting. It seemed alive, as if it were watching her. The figures in the archway appeared closer than they had before, their forms more distinct. Clara shook her head, blaming the long hours and her own growing obsession. But even as she told herself it was all her imagination, a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was changing, shifting subtly each time she looked away. She had always thought of art as a window into the artist's mind, but this felt like a door. And doors, Clara thought, could open. Clara woke up with a start, her heart racing. She'd fallen asleep in the living room, her makeshift workstation still lit by the dim glow of a desk lamp. The painting sat across the room, its golden arch shimmering faintly in the subdued light. Something had roused her, an uneasy sensation, as if someone had been standing over her just moments before. She rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. A quick glance at the clock showed it was just past 3 a.m. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. She turned toward the painting again, and her breath caught. The figures inside the arch seemed closer, more defined. Their elongated limbs reached outward, and their expressions, once indistinct, now conveyed something unsettling, urgency, perhaps even anger. Clara stood slowly, her pulse thundering in her ears. Her rational mind told her it was impossible. Paintings didn't change overnight, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She approached the canvas cautiously, her hands trembling. The air around the painting felt different, charged, as though it held a static buzz just beneath the surface. A soft knock at her window made her jump. Whirling around, she saw nothing but the faint outline of the fire escape. She lived on the 4th floor. No one should be out there at this hour. Yet the sound had been real. She was certain of it. Clara's fingers tightened into fists, her mind racing. Was she imagining things? Was her obsession with the painting playing tricks on her senses? The knock came again, louder this time. Clara's stomach dropped. She stepped closer to the window, squinting into the dim light. There was no one outside, no sign of movement, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Turning back to the painting, Clara felt her breath hitch. The golden archway seemed to glow brighter, and the figures inside were now fully visible. They weren't human. Their features were elongated, their eyes hollow voids that seemed to pierce right through her. They were reaching for something, something on this side of the canvas. A cold draft swept through the room, sending shivers down her spine. Clara stumbled back, her legs hitting the edge of the couch. The painting's hum had grown louder, a low, resonant sound that seemed to fill the space around her. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the noise wasn't just external. It reverberated inside her skull, a pulsing rhythm that set her teeth on edge. She backed away further, nearly tripping over the coffee table. She had to leave. She had to get out of the apartment. But even as her hand reached for the doorknob, something held her gaze on the painting. It was as though the figures in the archway were pleading with her, beckoning her closer, even as the air grew heavier and the humming grew deafening. By the time the first light of dawn filtered through her window, Clara felt as though she hadn't slept at all. The painting sat unmoving on the wall, but its presence weighed on her like a constant, heavy shadow. The glow of the golden archway seemed to dim in the daylight, yet the memory of those reaching figures remained sharp in her mind. Her laptop screen glared back at her, open to the numerous articles and forum threads she'd been combing through since the small hours of the morning. Every avenue of research she pursued seemed to lead nowhere. Legends about Carter's Hollow were vague at best, and references to Jean-Louis Reynaud were scattered and incomplete. Nothing she found explained the sensation of being watched, or the faint hum that had filled her apartment. Clara pushed herself away from the desk, running her hands through her hair. She had hoped to find a clear answer, some logical explanation that would help her make sense of what was happening. Instead, she only felt more isolated, more confused. Each theory she encountered, the painting as a spiritual doorway, the archway as a symbolic bridge, felt too abstract, too far removed from the immediate, visceral experience she'd had the night before. She glanced at the painting again, its surface now bathed in the gentle glow of the morning sun. The figures in the archway were no longer as distinct. The golden light looked more like what it had when she first purchased the piece. A faded hint of something extraordinary, but nothing overtly sinister. The rational part of her wanted to believe it had been a hallucination, brought on by exhaustion and stress. But another part of her, deeper and more instinctual, knew that wasn't true. Something had changed. Clara's phone buzzed on the table, startling her. It was a message from one of her colleagues, asking about her upcoming class. For a moment she considered replying, briefly entertaining the notion of resuming a normal life. But her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and instead she found herself typing a different question. Do you know any art historians who specialize in Reynaud? She hesitated before sending it, her thumb hovering over the button. She wasn't sure if she wanted anyone else involved, not after Henry's warnings. Still, she hit send. Her colleague responded quickly, suggesting a few names of professors and archivists who might help. Clara jotted them down, relief mingling with apprehension. Maybe these experts could shed light on Reynaud's work, on the purpose of the Golden Archway. Maybe they could even help her dispel the unease that had taken root in her mind. As she gathered her notes and prepared to contact them, a flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned sharply, staring at the painting. It remained still, unchanged. But Clara knew better. She had to act now before whatever was trapped inside it broke through. Clara drove across town to a small private library known for housing obscure art collections and historical archives. Inside, the scent of old paper and wood polish greeted her as she approached the front desk. She asked for Dr. Margot Lee, one of the art historians her colleague had suggested. Dr. Lee arrived moments later, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her sharp eyes scanned Clara with interest as they shook hands. "You have an original Reynaud?" she asked, her tone skeptical but intrigued. Clara nodded, her palms damp with anticipation. "At least I think so, but there's something unusual about it. I was hoping you could help me understand." They settled into a quiet reading room where Clara spread her photos, notes, and even a small section of the parchment she had carefully photocopied. Dr. Lee's brow furrowed as she examined each piece. She held up the photograph of the Golden Archway emerging from beneath the overpainted landscape, her lips pursed. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Lee murmured. "Reynaud was known for his light studies, but this level of detail is remarkable. It's almost luminous." She looked up at Clara. "You say this was hidden under another painting?" "Yes," Clara said. "And it's not just the archway. The figures inside, the sensation when I'm near the painting." She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "It feels like it's alive." Dr. Lee set down the photo and folded her hands. "Reynaud's disappearance has always been a mystery. Some believed he was experimenting with unusual techniques, trying to capture something beyond the physical. There were even rumors he dabbled in mysticism, though most of that is considered nonsense by the art community." Clara's stomach knotted. "Mysticism," Lee nodded. "Reynaud wrote in his letters about seeking the essence of light and form, about finding a way to transcend the limitations of paint and canvas. Of course, those writings have been dismissed as poetic ramblings, but..." She gestured to the photo. "This archway does look like more than just a visual study. If what you've uncovered is authentic, it might mean Reynaud was exploring ideas no one took seriously at the time." Clara leaned forward. "Could it explain the feelings I've had around the painting? The sensation of movement, the hum?" Dr. Lee held up a hand. "I can't speak to that, but I can tell you this. If Reynaud truly believed he was creating a gateway, and if you've already felt something unusual, it's worth proceeding with caution." Clara nodded slowly, a weight settling in her chest. "I understand. I need to know what it all means." Dr. Lee studied her carefully. "If you're determined to continue, I can help, but be prepared. Art like this, if it carries the weight you suspect, may come with more questions than answers." As Clara and Dr. Lee continued their discussion, a soft knock came at the door of the reading room. A young assistant poked his head in and whispered something to Dr. Lee, who nodded in acknowledgement before turning back to Clara. "There's someone here who claims they might have information about the painting," Dr. Lee said, a note of surprise in her voice. "A collector of obscure art who was doing research in our archives. He overheard me discussing Renaud and asked if he could join the conversation. Clara hesitated. Did you give him any details about the painting? No, Dr. Lee assured her, but he seemed very eager to talk. After a moment of deliberation, Clara nodded. All right, let's see what he has to say. A few minutes later, a tall man in his 50s entered the room. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, and carried himself with a quiet authority. His silver hair and sharp features gave him a distinguished air, but his expression was warm as he introduced himself. I'm Victor Kane, he said, shaking Clara's hand. I specialize in lost and private collections. I've been following Renaud's work for years, but I've never encountered anything like what you've just described. Clara felt a mix of curiosity and wariness. How did you hear about the painting? I happened to be reviewing some old letters in the archive, Victor explained. When I heard Dr. Lee mention Renaud and a golden archway, I couldn't help but inquire. His works have fascinated me for decades. He gestured toward the photographs Clara had laid out. May I? Dr. Lee nodded. By all means. Victor picked up one of the photos, his brow furrowing as he studied the image of the golden archway. After a long moment, he set it down and looked at Clara. You're right to be concerned, he said. Renaud's final works were shrouded in secrecy. He was known for experimenting with layered compositions, but toward the end of his life, his focus shifted. The few scholars who studied him believed he was attempting to portray something transcendent. Clara leaned forward. What do you mean by transcendent? Victor hesitated. Let's just say he was no longer satisfied with capturing the physical world. He sought to paint what lies beyond it. Dr. Lee spoke up. I've read about these theories, but most of the art community dismissed them as fanciful. Are you suggesting Renaud might have succeeded? Victor's gaze lingered on the photo. It's possible. And if he did, it would explain why someone felt compelled to obscure this work. Perhaps it wasn't just about the art. It was about what the painting might reveal. Clara's heart raced. So, what should I do now? Victor considered her question for a moment before replying. If you truly want to understand this painting, you need to uncover everything Renaud hid. But I must warn you, pursuing this may take you into very uncharted territory. Victor's words stayed with Clara long after their meeting ended. Back home, she couldn't stop thinking about what he had said, that Renaud had been trying to paint something beyond the physical. The idea made her stomach twist with equal parts fear and intrigue. Was it possible that the Golden Arch was more than a simple artistic choice? Could it really be a symbol or even a conduit of something larger? The more she thought about it, the more determined she became. Clara returned to her research, pulling together every scrap of information she could find on Renaud's final years. She delved into old exhibition catalogues, scanned blurry photographs of his surviving works, and pored over translated letters that hinted at a shift in his style and focus. The pattern that emerged was subtle but undeniable. Renaud had grown increasingly preoccupied with light, specifically with the way it seemed to dissolve the boundary between the material and the immaterial. One of the letters stood out. In it, Renaud described his desire to capture the light that binds the visible to the invisible. He wrote of a luminous threshold, and how, in his words, to step through it is to see the world anew. Clara couldn't help but draw a connection to the Golden Arch. Was this the threshold he had mentioned? And if so, what lay beyond it? Feeling the weight of these revelations, Clara turned back to the painting. She decided it was time to remove more of the surface layer. With her tools carefully laid out, she began the painstaking process of cleaning and revealing another section of the canvas. Each stroke of her hand exposed more details. fine filigree patterns that adorned the arch, faint figures that seemed to move and shift when she glanced away, and a strange, almost radiant glow that grew more pronounced the closer she got to the center of the composition. Hours passed as Clara worked. The apartment grew silent, the world outside fading into the background. All that existed was the painting and the mysteries it held. By the time she set her tools down, a significant portion of the golden arch was fully revealed. The figures beyond it were still blurred, but their forms were clearer than ever. They appeared to be standing at the threshold, one arm extended as if beckoning her forward. Clara leaned back, rubbing her eyes. She wasn't imagining it. There was something deeply unsettling about the figures. They seemed to demand her attention, as though they were aware of her presence. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She knew she couldn't stop now. She was closer than ever to understanding Reno's vision, and perhaps even to discovering the truth about what he had left behind. Clara spent the following day comparing her notes, photos of the painting, and the new details she'd uncovered to anything resembling Reno's other works. One theme grew increasingly clear. None of his surviving paintings had anything like the Golden Archway. The closest pieces were studies of light, portraits of glowing candles or streams of sunlight spilling through a window. Beautiful, yes, but not otherworldly. The Golden Arch was something else entirely, and what lay beyond it was unlike anything she'd ever seen depicted in art. As more of the figures in the archway emerged, she began to notice what looked like movement. Not literal motion, of course, but the way the figures were painted gave them the appearance of shifting, flowing, like smoke caught in a beam of light. Clara set the painting down and paced the room. "It's just a trick of the brushwork," she muttered to herself. "Reno was experimenting with depth or color theory or something." But her own words felt hollow. Deep down, she couldn't deny the strange energy she felt whenever she got too close to the canvas. The golden paint shimmered faintly under her lamp, almost pulsing. It made her think of the hum she'd heard that night, the sensation that someone or something had been watching her. Taking a deep breath, Clara sat down in front of the painting once more. She leaned closer, studying the arch's intricate patterns. They weren't just decorative, they were precise, almost mathematical. Lines and curves interwove in ways that drew the eye inward, toward the center of the arch. And at that center, she saw what appeared to be a small opening, a dark oval surrounded by golden light. Her fingers hovered over the canvas. She didn't touch it, but the air above the surface felt different, cooler, heavier. Clara pulled her hand back and rubbed her palm against her jeans. "What are you trying to show me?" she whispered. The figures within the arch seemed more distinct than ever. One of them, its form more humanoid than the others, appeared to be reaching outward, as if toward her. Its outstretched hand glimmered faintly, and its face, though blurred, seemed to radiate a sense of urgency. Clara tried to shake off the feeling that the painting was alive. After all, it was impossible. Paint couldn't move, brushstrokes couldn't shift. And yet, she couldn't tear her eyes away from the arch's dark center, that tiny oval that seemed to pull at her attention like a magnet. It wasn't just an artistic focal point, it was something deeper. As the last light of the day dimmed outside her apartment, Clara leaned back, her mind racing. If the Golden Arch was a portal, as the patterns, the figures, and the energy all suggested, then the question wasn't just what lies beyond it, but should I let it open? Clara couldn't sleep that night. The painting, covered now with a protective cloth, seemed to loom larger than life. Every time she closed her eyes, the golden archway appeared in her mind, the figure's outstretched limbs beckoning her closer. Her dreams were restless, filled with swirling light and distant whispers she couldn't quite understand. Around midnight, a soft knock at the door startled her. She hesitated, her pulse racing. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to knock occasionally, but something about the timing felt wrong. Slowly, she made her way to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. She opened the door a crack, the hallway empty except for a small envelope lying on the floor. Frowning, Clara picked it up and shut the door behind her. The envelope was unmarked, the paper slightly yellowed. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. As she unfolded it, her breath caught. The handwriting was old, its ink faded but legible. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable: Jean-Louis Renaud. Clara sank into the nearest chair, her heart pounding. It was impossible. Renaud had been gone for more than a century. How could a letter from him end up on her doorstep? She studied the note carefully, her eyes scanning the elegant looping script. To the finder of my final work. If you have uncovered the arch, you must tread carefully. It is not simply a window, but a passage. It can show you the light beyond our world, but only if you are willing to see. There are dangers. Do not proceed lightly. The path is beautiful, but it is not without cost. Clara's hands trembled as she read the final line. When you step through, you cannot return unchanged. She folded the letter and placed it carefully on the table, her mind racing. It couldn't be real. It must be a forgery, a trick, a prank. And yet the parchment, the ink, the signature, all of it seemed authentic. If this letter was genuine, it confirmed what she had been feeling all along. The painting was more than art. It was a doorway, one that Renaud had created at great risk. Her first instinct was to destroy it. She didn't want to become entangled in whatever Renaud had been trying to achieve. But another part of her, driven by curiosity, by the pull of the unknown, refused to let it go. Clara had come too far to stop now. She needed to know what Renaud had seen. She needed to understand why he had created the arch and why he had vanished after completing it. As she sat in the dim light of her apartment, Clara realized she was no longer just uncovering a lost masterpiece. She was following in Renaud's footsteps, and she was walking into the unknown. The next morning, Clara awoke with a sense of resolve. She knew she couldn't continue to dance around the truth of what she had discovered. The painting demanded her attention, and the letter, whether authentic or not, was a clear message. If she wanted answers, she had to take the next step. She removed the protective cloth, revealing the golden arch in full daylight. The figures beyond it seemed clearer than ever, their forms now distinct enough that she could make out faces. They looked neither friendly nor hostile, just watchful, their elongated arms still stretched outward, beckoning her toward the shimmering oval at the center of the arch. Clara's heart pounded as she adjusted the room's lighting, setting up a single bright lamp focused on the canvas. She had gathered every piece of cleaning equipment she owned, but something told her that this next step wasn't just about removing layers of paint. It was about stepping closer, allowing herself to fully experience whatever the painting wanted her to see. As she leaned in, the air grew heavy. That faint hum she had once noticed was now unmistakable, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate inside her chest. Her breathing quickened. "It's just a trick of the mind," she muttered under her breath. "It's just paint." But when she touched the edge of the canvas, she felt a jolt of cold shoot through her fingertips. Her first instinct was to pull back, but something compelled her to stay. She pressed her hand lightly against the painted surface, half expecting her fingers to meet resistance. Instead, they passed through. Clara gasped, her pulse racing as her hand disappeared up to the wrist. The texture of the canvas had given way to something cool and fluid. It felt like dipping her hand into a stream of icy water, yet the canvas itself remained still and intact. Her rational mind reeled. This wasn't possible. And yet, it was happening. She tried to withdraw her hand, but it didn't move. Panic surged through her as she tugged harder, the painted surface rippling slightly, as if her hand were caught in a liquid membrane. The figures in the arch seemed to shift, their watchful gazes sharpening. She felt no pain, only a sense of being held in place. A soft voice, barely more than a whisper, echoed in her mind. It wasn't in any language she recognized, yet she understood the meaning. "Come closer." Clara's chest heaved. She wanted to scream, to run, but something about the voice calmed her. Her racing thoughts slowed, and she found herself leaning forward. She could see through the oval now, glimpsing a world of brilliant otherworldly light and shifting landscapes. The figures extended their hands further, and Clara felt herself moving closer, drawn toward the light. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifying. The threshold was open, and there was no turning back. Clara hesitated at the edge of the golden arch, her heart racing as she peered into the shifting light. The figures beyond the arch seemed almost alive now, their features clearer, their arms outstretched in silent invitation. The whispers she'd heard before returned, faint yet insistent, coaxing her forward. She pulled her hand back from the canvas. No, not canvas anymore, but something else entirely. Her fingers felt chilled, the sensation lingering, as though she'd touched ice. The painting's surface rippled gently, as if waiting for her to make a decision. She thought of Renaud's letter, his warning. "When you step through, you cannot return unchanged." Her mind warred with itself. Curiosity pushed her to see what lay beyond, but fear urged her to stop before it was too late. The logical part of her shouted that this couldn't be real, that what she was experiencing was impossible. But deep down, Clara knew it was real. Every instinct told her that whatever she did next would change her forever. Slowly, she reached out again. Her hand passed through the archway once more, and the icy sensation spread up her arm. This time, she didn't pull back. She took a step forward, her breath catching as her body followed her hand. The air around her seemed to shift, growing warmer, yet more distant, as though the room itself was fading. As she moved through the archway, light engulfed her. It was blinding at first, then softened into a shimmering glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Shapes swirled in the brightness, unfamiliar landscapes vast and ethereal. She saw hills that rolled like waves, rivers of liquid gold, and skies that glimmered with 1,000 colors. The beauty was overwhelming, and for a moment she forgot her fear. The figures she had seen within the painting were no longer static. They moved gracefully around her, their forms translucent and otherworldly. They didn't speak, but their presence filled her mind with images and emotions. She felt a strange sense of belonging, as though she had stepped into a place that had been waiting for her. But just as Clara began to relax, she noticed something darker in the distance. Beyond the glowing hills and shimmering rivers was a shadow, vast, shapeless, and pulsing faintly. It didn't approach, but its presence was unmistakable. The whispers that had guided her forward were now joined by a low, resonant hum, one that made her chest tighten. Her instinct was to turn back, to flee back through the arch, but when she turned around, the doorway had changed. It was still there, but it shimmered faintly, its edges blurred. The figures surrounding her didn't stop her, but their gaze felt heavier now, almost expectant. Clara took a step back toward the arch, unsure if she could return, unsure if she even wanted to. The threshold wasn't just a portal, it was a choice, and the decision was hers, alone. Clara stood frozen, staring at the vast, pulsing shadow that loomed in the distance. The shimmering world around her suddenly felt colder, more menacing. The light no longer seemed welcoming, but rather too bright, too harsh. The figures that had once seemed serene now hovered silently, their elongated limbs still outstretched, as if urging her to continue. But she couldn't move. A voice, deep, resonant, and utterly unlike the whispers she'd heard before, broke the silence. "Why have you come?" It wasn't spoken aloud. Instead, the words resonated inside her mind, powerful and commanding. Clara shivered, unsure if it was the shadow speaking or if the world itself had found a way to communicate. I wanted to understand, she stammered. I wanted to know why this painting exists, why it was hidden. The shadow pulsed, its edges rippling like dark waves. You seek answers, yet answers come with cost. Are you prepared to pay it? Clara's throat tightened. She thought of Renault's letter, his warning that stepping through the arch would leave her changed. She glanced back at the shimmering doorway, now faint and flickering. It still existed, but it no longer felt like a solid exit. The figures behind her were motionless, their gaze piercing. What is the cost? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The shadow's presence seemed to expand, filling the space with an oppressive weight. Truth is a burden. To see beyond the veil is to leave part of yourself behind. You may never return the same. Do you still wish to know? Clara looked around her. The beauty of the light-filled landscape was undeniable, but the shadow's warning made her question whether it was worth it. Yet a part of her, a relentless, curious part, couldn't turn away. She had come this far, uncovered so much, risked so much. She had to know. Yes, she said finally, her voice trembling. I need to know. The shadow's pulsing grew faster, its form darkening until it was almost solid. Then slowly it began to recede, shrinking back into the distant horizon. The figures around Clara turned toward her, their expressions unreadable, but no longer neutral. They seemed to acknowledge her choice. Then you will see, the voice intoned, fading as the shadow disappeared. The light brightened, the world shifting once more. Clara braced herself, unsure what she would face next. But she knew she couldn't stop now. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. The oppressive weight in the air lifted as the shadow receded, leaving Clara in the center of a glowing expanse. The figures that had once been passive now moved with a fluid grace, their elongated forms weaving patterns in the air that seemed both purposeful and random. Clara's fear dulled, replaced by a strange, calm curiosity. Ahead of her, the horizon shimmered like a mirage. Shapes appeared and disappeared, landscapes forming and dissolving in an instant. She saw rolling hills that turned into endless forests, rivers that flowed upward into the sky, and structures that seemed alive, shifting and reconfiguring themselves. The longer Clara looked, the more she felt her sense of reality stretching. This wasn't just a world beyond the painting. It was something far greater, something that defied comprehension. The whispers returned, but they weren't voices this time. They were sensations, impressions. Clara understood without words that she was being shown a fragment of what Renault had discovered. He hadn't just painted an image. He had captured a window into the infinite, a realm where the boundaries of space and time dissolved. Clara stepped forward cautiously. The ground underfoot was firm, but felt more like glass than earth. Every step sent ripples through the environment, causing the glowing figures to turn their attention to her. She reached out toward one of them, her hand hovering inches away from its translucent form. It radiated warmth, and as she moved closer, she felt a rush of emotions, not her own, but something alien. Curiosity, patience, and something she could only describe as hope. The figure leaned toward her, and for a moment, she thought she could see its face. It was familiar, almost human, but with features that seemed to shift slightly, as though it was trying to find the right shape. The moment didn't last. The figure turned and gestured toward the horizon, where the light grew brighter, almost blinding. Clara squinted, shielding her eyes. The shimmering light wasn't just bright, it was alive. It pulsed in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and within it she glimpsed more forms. They were larger than the figures near her, more defined. They stood still, observing, their presence heavy with meaning. The whispers grew stronger, and for the first time, Clara felt as though she understood their message. Renaud had sought this realm, not out of greed or ambition, but out of wonder. He had tried to capture something that couldn't be contained on a canvas, something that couldn't be explained in human terms. This was why he had vanished. He hadn't been taken or destroyed. He had chosen to stay. Clara's pulse quickened as the realization hit her. The Golden Arch wasn't just a gateway for her, it had been Renaud's too. And now she stood at the same crossroads, her choice still uncertain. The glowing figures stood before Clara, their gestures urging her onward, yet their forms remained distant, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Behind her, the Golden Arch shimmered faintly, a fragile reminder of the world she'd left. The doorway was still open, but its edges seemed softer now, less defined, and each moment she hesitated, it grew harder to tell if it truly remained. She turned her gaze forward. The horizon rippled, the radiant light intensifying as if to say, "Look at what could be yours." The vastness called to her, not in words, but in feelings, possibilities unfurling in her mind, visions of understanding, of creation beyond anything she could have imagined. She saw herself painting in a way she never had before, her hands guided by knowledge that transcended her own. She felt a sense of purpose so strong it left her breathless. But the shadows lingered at the edges. Not the massive form that had receded earlier, but something subtler, an undercurrent of unease. For all its beauty, this place carried weight. Clara could feel it in her chest, a pressure that grew heavier with every passing second. To step further might mean giving up more than she realized. She would gain something extraordinary, but what would she lose? The figures moved again, their elongated forms reaching toward the light. One turned back to her, its face no longer indistinct. Clara saw something there, an echo of familiarity. It wasn't Renaud, yet it bore his mark. She remembered his words, "When you step through, you cannot return unchanged." Her mind spun with questions. Had Renaud become part of this place? Was that why his signature remained in the painting, why his presence lingered in the whispers and the light? If she stepped further, would she lose herself in the same way? The painting had always been a mystery, a puzzle waiting to be solved. But standing here, Clara realized it wasn't the painting that needed understanding. It was her own willingness to let go of the known and embrace the unknown. She thought of her life back home, her students, her quiet apartment filled with books and canvases. That life now seemed so small, so contained, and yet it was hers. She looked back at the arch. The figures behind her remained still, their presence no longer urging her forward. They too seemed to wait. The doorway flickered faintly, its light fragile and pulsing. It was still a choice, and it was still hers to make. Clara took a deep breath. This was the crossroads. One step forward, and she would see what Renaud had seen. One step back, and she could return to the world she knew. Her hand hovered in the air, and for the first time, she felt a calm certainty settle over her. Her lips parted, and she whispered, "I'm ready." Clara drew in a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the horizon's shimmering light. The whispers had grown softer now, less urgent, but they still nudged at the edges of her consciousness. The glowing figures seemed almost patient, their watchful gazes waiting for her decision. Behind her, the Golden Arch flickered faintly, a reminder that the way back remained, if only barely. She took one last look over her shoulder at the arch. It felt impossibly distant, as though the very act of considering the step forward had stretched the distance between herself and the doorway. Her mind raced. Could she go back to her old life, knowing this place existed, knowing that Renaud had walked this path and left it behind for her to find? Clara turned forward again. The horizon pulsed with light, the warmth of it reaching out to her. The figures ahead seemed to shift slightly, creating a narrow path that led deeper into the radiant expanse. Clara felt a pull, like gravity, urging her to move. With trembling fingers, she touched the air before her and felt the cool ripple once again, a sensation like stepping into a gentle stream. Her foot moved forward. As she crossed the threshold, the world exploded into color and sound. It was unlike anything she had experienced before, a rush of sensations that filled her mind and body all at once. The air itself seemed alive, every particle vibrating with energy. The figures that had been so distant now surrounded her, their forms no longer hazy but luminous and distinct. Their faces carried expressions she couldn't quite describe, their gazes filled with something ancient and knowing. The landscape shifted with every step Clara took. Hills melted into rivers, rivers rose into the sky, and colors she had no name for swirled around her. She felt weightless, as though her very being was dissolving into the light. Yet she remained aware of herself. Her memories, her thoughts, her choices. She wasn't losing who she was. Instead, it was as though her essence was being woven into something greater. The whispers returned, clear now. They weren't words exactly, but feelings, understanding, curiosity, connection. Clara felt them settle into her mind, filling gaps she hadn't known were there. She saw glimpses of Reno, his hands brushing the surface of the canvas, his eyes fixed on the golden arch. She felt his hope, his fear, his yearning to show the world the beauty he had glimpsed. Then the whispers faded, leaving her in silence. The light around her pulsed one final time, and the glowing figures began to step back, their gazes soft but deliberate. Clara knew that they had given her what they could, and now she was on her own. As the light dimmed slightly, the landscape solidified. Clara stood in a place that felt both alien and familiar. The world was new, yet she recognized it in her bones. She had crossed the threshold, and everything had changed. Clara stood motionless, her senses overwhelmed by the sheer vibrancy of her surroundings. The landscape continued to shift, but now it felt intentional, as if responding to her presence. The figures that had once beckoned her forward faded into the background, still visible but no longer the focal point. Their task was done, and they left her alone to take in the magnitude of what she'd chosen to experience. The light around her was different now, warmer, softer, yet still carrying that unearthly quality. Colors moved in waves, blending and separating in ways that defied logic. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, yet it hummed faintly as though alive. Clara's breathing slowed as she let herself relax, taking in each sensation one by one. Her thoughts turned to Renaud. She understood now why he had disappeared, why he had poured his life into capturing this place. It wasn't a single location. It was a state of being, a realm where form and light intertwined, where everything existed in fluid harmony. He must have realized that no canvas could ever truly contain it. The golden archway had been his attempt to guide others here, to show them what he had seen. But for Clara, it felt like more than that. It felt like an invitation not just to see, but to become part of this world. She walked slowly, the environment shifting around her with each step. Hills appeared and vanished, rivers formed and flowed upward into the glowing sky. The air carried a faint melody, a sound that wasn't quite music but filled her with a sense of purpose. Clara had spent so much time searching for meaning in Renaud's work, and now she realized the meaning was never meant to be explained. It had to be experienced. The further she ventured, the clearer her path became. The glowing figures she had seen earlier reappeared briefly, their elongated forms trailing ribbons of light. They moved with a deliberate grace, their gestures guiding her attention toward a single point on the horizon. Clara followed their lead, her steps growing surer as the humming beneath her feet grew stronger. She didn't need to ask where she was going. She felt it in her core, as if she had known all along. As the path narrowed, the environment grew brighter. The light enveloped her fully, warm and soothing. Clara felt no fear, no hesitation. She thought of her life before the painting, her students, her quiet routines, and a small, bittersweet smile crossed her face. That life was still hers in a way, but it was no longer the limit of her existence. She had crossed a threshold into something larger. The figures faded once more, leaving Clara alone at the edge of a new horizon. She took one final breath and stepped forward, the radiant world welcoming her fully. Clara Morgan, art teacher, seeker, and accidental explorer, had found the infinite, and she had become part of it. For what felt like hours, or perhaps only moments, Clara stood at the edge of this radiant expanse, her senses steeped in light and sound. She had lost track of time, her thoughts untethered from their usual patterns. Yet deep within her, a small voice whispered a reminder. She didn't belong here forever. The glowing figures reappeared, their forms more distinct now. They moved purposefully, their gestures calm but resolute. One figure stepped forward and extended a hand, not beckoning this time, but guiding her gaze back toward the golden arch. Clara turned, and for the first time since crossing into this world, she could see it clearly. The archway shimmered like a fragile window. Its edges flickered, and beyond it, she saw the faint outline of her apartment, the familiar shadows of bookshelves, the glow of a single lamp on her desk. It felt distant, almost unreal after everything she had experienced here. Clara looked back at the figures. "I can go back?" she asked, her voice trembling. They didn't speak, but the air itself seemed to answer. A gentle push, neither forceful nor commanding, urged her toward the arch. Clara hesitated, her heart aching with indecision. This world was extraordinary, filled with wonders she could hardly comprehend. But it wasn't her world, not entirely. She took a step toward the arch, then another. The hum she had felt before returned, but it was quieter now, less overwhelming. As she reached the threshold, she turned back one last time. The figures stood still, their forms illuminated against the shifting horizon. They seemed neither sorrowful nor expectant, only patient. Clara stepped through the arch, and the world of light and motion faded. In an instant, she was back in her apartment, standing before the canvas that had started it all. The painting was as it had been before, the golden arch, a static image. The hum was gone, the figures still. Yet Clara knew something had changed, within the painting and within herself. She touched her chest, her breath steady. She felt no fear, no regret. Whatever she had glimpsed on the other side, she carried it with her now. Reynaud's vision was no longer just his. It had become part of her as well. She didn't need to explain it. She didn't need others to understand. What mattered was that she had seen it and returned. The weeks after Clara's return passed in a haze of quiet contemplation. She found herself walking the same streets, visiting the same cafes, and greeting the same neighbors. But everything felt subtly different. The light seemed warmer now, more alive. Sounds carried a texture she hadn't noticed before. Even the gentle rustling of leaves outside her window stirred a sense of connectedness she couldn't explain. Her painting classes took on a new energy. Clara no longer merely taught techniques and composition. She spoke with a passion that electrified the room, urging her students to see beyond the surface of their work. "What's beneath the paint matters," she would say, her words taking on a depth that made her students listen more closely, even if they didn't fully understand. She saw their curiosity grow, saw their art begin to shift, and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or praise. At home, the golden-arched painting still hung on her wall. She would sit before it in the evenings, not cleaning or restoring it anymore. but simply gazing at it. The figures remained frozen in their painted world, yet Clara felt no disappointment. She had seen them move. She had felt their presence. That was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara set down her brush and walked to the painting. She traced the edge of the frame with her fingertips. "I'm not sure why you chose me," she murmured, "but thank you." She reached for her phone and took a photo of the painting, the golden arch glowing faintly in the lamp's light. She considered sending it to a colleague, or perhaps even publishing an article about her discovery. But she stopped herself. This was her story, her experience. No article, no photograph could capture what she had lived. The world didn't need to know the details. What mattered was how it had changed her. Over time, Clara found herself painting more than ever, her canvases filled with colors and forms that mirrored the light she had seen on the other side. People who visited her studio remarked on how different her work felt, how it seemed to glow from within. Clara would only smile, not bothering to explain. One day she stumbled across an old notebook of hers from years ago. Flipping through it, she found sketches of ordinary landscapes, simple still lifes, and familiar cityscapes. She smiled at how far she'd come. The lines in those old drawings seemed so timid now, so hesitant. She placed the notebook beside her latest canvas, a radiant swirl of golds and blues that seemed to pulse with life. Clara didn't think about the golden archway often anymore. She didn't need to. It had already given her what she needed: a sense of wonder, a deeper connection to the world, and the courage to keep moving forward. The golden arch had shown her the infinite, and though she had returned, she was forever changed. Years passed, and Clara's life settled into a quiet rhythm. She continued to teach, her classes growing ever more popular as word spread about her unique approach. Students came not just to learn technique, but to experience the sense of curiosity and wonder she brought into the room. Many remarked on how her presence made them feel like they could see the world differently, like they were part of something larger, something meaningful. Clara still visited the painting every evening. Its golden arch remained unchanged, a silent sentinel on her wall. She never tried to alter it again, never tried to reopen the portal. The whispers, the humming, the strange shifting sensations, those were gone. But the feeling of connection never faded. It lingered in the air around the painting, faint but constant. One evening, after her last class of the day, Clara sat down with a new canvas. The room was dim, except for the warm glow of a single desk lamp. She dipped her brush into a palette of vibrant hues, letting her mind wander as she worked. The brushstrokes flowed easily, the image coming together in a way that felt almost effortless. It was as if the light she had once seen through the arch still guided her hand, its influence now a quiet presence rather than an overwhelming force. She lost herself in the act of painting. The room grew still, the only sound the gentle swish of the brush against the canvas. Hours passed, though Clara hardly noticed. When she finally stepped back, the finished piece seemed to radiate warmth. The colors danced together in a harmony that felt alive. Clara sat back and smiled. She didn't need to question where the inspiration came from. It was all part of the same thread that had woven itself into her life long ago. The golden arch had led her to this, not by showing her answers, but by showing her the beauty of the questions. That night, she walked to the painting for the last time. She touched the edge of the frame, then let her hand rest on the surface. The texture was rough and cool, nothing unusual. Yet she felt the connection all the same. "Thank you," she whispered. Clara turned off the lamp and stepped away. The painting, still and silent, remained on the wall as she left the room. The archway had done its work, guiding her to a place she never thought she'd reach. It had changed her, not by pulling her into its world, but by helping her see the infinite beauty in her own. Clara never sought to uncover its secrets again. She didn't need to. The circle had closed, and she was content.